Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming in today. I want to ask Mr. Breen about the clinical indemnity scheme, and in this I've spoken to the clerk before the meeting. I have a personal interest in this and the Chair, but we think it's a matter of public interest and not a conflict as such, so I just wanted to mention that at the outset. But I do want to ask you about the clinical indemnity scheme, and in particular how it relates to maternity hospitals. There was a report by Peter Boylan in the last number of years about the scale of injuries that can happen in neonatal situations, either to women or to young babies, with life-altering consequences, obviously. In some cases. So I just want to ask, obviously State Claims Agency manages the clinical indemnity scheme. I want to ask a couple of things. The costs of that over the last number of years, and whether the profile is changing, how it is changing, if it is changing, just to get a bit better understanding about it. And then I just want to ask you as well, please, about the National Incident Management System. But would you like to just, is there anything you'd like to say just in the first instance, Mr. Breen?
Yes, the clinical indemnity scheme is a particular challenge in terms of its cost, as you know, and you've mentioned, incidents involving catastrophic injuries to babies and indeed just generally in clinical negligence. The fact of the matter is that, the costs associated with these cerebral palsy cases are very high, and obviously there's significant injury to children, which families have to carry in terms of the cost of future care and looking after children over a period of time. The profile hasn't changed terribly over the number of years that we've been dealing with it, except that the costs have continued to increase fairly dramatically. But if you're looking at, for example, incidents in relation to cerebral palsy, just to break it down for you, in 2016 we had 21 such cases, in 2017 24, 2018 17, 2019 27, and in 2020 12, and in the year to date 6. So you can see that that's a total, by the way, of 107 to take it right up to date, and that's it's a fairly consistent incidence rate being notified to us. One of the difficulties, of course, sometimes is that for families, the diagnosis of cerebral palsy takes some time, and then the claim isn't made for many years later until, first of all, there's some knowledge as to how the child might be progressing, what the child will require, and what the child's life expectancy might be.
Yes, and so that's interesting that there's the same number of cases reported, and of course it does take time for a brain injury diagnosis of some kind to manifest and to be aware. What I'm interested in then is the risk notification by the hospitals, because in many of these cases, and I don't presume to know about all of them, in many of these cases there are circumstances in which it could have possibly been avoided, and obviously from the state's perspective, for the protection of its citizens, and also from a financial perspective, it wants to avoid as many of those cases as absolutely possible. So I have two questions really. One is around the risk register and the National Incident Management System. When something happens, it may not be apparent to the hospital or the parents that a brain injury has occurred. Are the hospitals consistently reporting incidents that were risky, that were concerning, where they don't know possibly the outcome? And how is that translated then to what actually happens in terms of litigation? So I suppose my question is, let's say there's a difficult birth, there's questions around it, not really sure how the child is, they may or may not be in the neonatal unit. Are the hospitals consistently referring those things to you in a way that you have been able to analyse to show that they have been doing it correctly, sufficiently, accurately? The reason that sorry, if you want to answer that first.
Yes. Firstly, can I say that we are notified roughly over, to give you an idea of the number of incidents overall. Now, this covers clinical and non-clinical. In 2018, on our NIMS system, which is the National Incident Management System, we had 200,000 in 2019, 213,000, 211,000 in 2020, and 150,000 to date. And you're right, Deputy, what normally happens is that when a clinical incident occurs in a hospital, particularly if it's serious, and particularly incidents involving a child who, after birth, obviously has had some difficulties and is in a neonatal intensive care unit, for example. Hospitals are good generally at advising those to us, and we pick up on them because, as you say, they're a vital source of data in relation to lessons learned. And that's one of the things that our clinical risk team is always engaged in, is an analysis of these incidents as they are notified to us.
And where they're happening in the hospital.
Now, there are some incidents which, escape the net, and they're not timelessly, advised to us, and that happens. And we have a key performance indicator system with all of our hospitals, whereby we look at their rates of reporting to us, and we write to them if we feel that they're falling short of what we believe to be acceptable for an acute hospital or a maternity hospital, for example.
And so, for example, that's very interesting then, that there seems to be a very large number reported relative to I know that they're not all cerebral palsy cases or anything of that nature, and of course there are a much broader range of cases. I know you're only giving that as an example. But let's say, for example, I speak to parents who have gone through litigation processes, either to secure funds for their child for the long term, or to, in other cases where there's been a death, because they felt there was no other measure of accountability with the hospital, that the hospital wasn't responding to them, that they felt the board hadn't taken it seriously, and that they weren't being responded to. And I don't want to name any cases, but there have been cases this year in the media where things like that have happened. If, for example, then somebody has a risky situation like that and it has been notified to the NIM system, is there any obligation on the hospital to tell the parents, to tell the family?
That they have reported it to us?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure that there's a specific obligation on them to notify that they've notified it to us. But equally, I don't think that there's any prohibition on a particular hospital telling parents that they have reported it on the National Incident Management System.
I suppose from the perspective of the parents whom I speak to, they feel that litigation is the only way that they can get a dialogue with the hospital, or that they can get a response from the hospital. I wonder, are there ways in which we can change the clinical indemnity scheme to require, where an incident is notified, that the patient or the parents of the patient are also notified, just as a matter of basic courtesy?
Yes, well, I think one of the great innovations, and would meet some of the issues that you're mentioning there, if we could have it, and we haven't had it to date, is the pre-action protocol, for example, where we remove all of the adversarial side of, having to serve your proceedings, so that you would find yourself in a pre-proceedings environment where both plaintiff and hospital defendant can meet each other in a much calmer, less pressurised atmosphere, and isolate and net out what are the particular issues for the hospital, and then move towards something like, alternative dispute resolution, like mediation, which we favour. And I think that would be a great innovation.
I totally agree with that. And have you found any of the hospitals resistant to that? It seems like such an obvious thing to do for the holistic care of their patients.
No, in truth, Deputy, we don't get resistance from hospitals in relation to, for example, anything to do with the litigation process. In fact, hospitals generally, particularly in the case of a damaged infant and a brain-damaged infant, because these are such tragic cases, will want us to deal with them as quickly as we possibly can. And that's what, we wish to do as well, to, get to the end of cases in the shortest possible period of time.
Yes, I think the media reporting might sit slightly against what you're saying. I'm not wishing to contradict you, but the experience of parents is somewhat different, not with yourselves, but with the hospital management generally. I'm conscious I've only 30 seconds. I don't know, Chair, if we're getting a second round later on or anything like that.
Yes, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. Thank you so much, Ms.